Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're talking about one of the biggest secrets to consistently finding elk after the rut, the food they key in on in October. By the time September fades and the bugles die down, elk priorities shift fast. The chaos of the rut burns a tremendous amount of energy, and bulls enter October worn down, underweight, and running on fumes. This is when survival replaces breeding as their driving instinct. They're still in the same general terrain, but their focus narrows to calories, security, and efficiency. The rut makes elk reckless, right? October makes them tactical. The difference between finding elk in this phase and walking past them comes down to one thing: understanding what they're eating and how that diet changes with the season. If you can identify what's still green, what's still holding moisture, and which slopes are producing the highest nutrient value, you can narrow down the massive stretches of country into a handful of high odds zones. This episode breaks down exactly how that works. We're going to talk about the forage shifts that follow the rut, how bulls transition from high protein summer diets to energy rich fall feed, what specific plants and slopes hold value through October, and how to recognize the subtle signs that tell you you're in active feeding ground. Because while most hunters are still looking for bugles or, big herds, the ones who find feed are the ones who keep finding elk. So let's dive in. When the rut ends, everything about elk behavior changes almost overnight. Testosterone drops, vocalization stops, and bulls that were chasing cows and burning daylight suddenly vanish into thick cover. To most hunters, it feels like the elk just disappeared, but they didn't. They simply changed their focus from bedding to rebuilding. By early October, bulls are in recovery mode. Their bodies are depleted, their fat reserves are low, and their priority is replenishment. A mature bull can lose up to 30% of his body weight during the rut. That's the difference between entering winter strong and starving out before spring. So from the moment the rut winds down, every decision they make is centered around food and efficiency, right? Maximizing their nutrition for minimal risk. The first key to understanding October food patterns is realizing why their diet changes. During summer and early rut, elk feed heavily on high-protein forbs, broadleaf plants, and grasses that help build muscle and sustain stamina. But as the growing season ends and frost hits the high country, those plants lose moisture and nutritional value fast. Protein levels drop, and elk shift towards carbohydrate-heavy feeds that provide energy and fat for winter survival. In simple terms, they're no longer eating for power, they're eating for endurance. You'll notice this shift in elevation and movement too. During September, elk might feed across wide open meadows at dawn and dusk, often at mid to high elevations where lush feed was abundant. But once frost starts biting, the nutrient profile of those grasses changes overnight. The tops dry out, the sugars in the stalks decline. That's when elk start dropping a few hundred feet in elevation, keying in on south and southeast slopes where green vegetation lingers longer due to sun exposure. Another big factor is temperature and moisture. In early October, warm afternoons can still trigger regrowth of certain grasses and forbs in shaded pockets, drainages, and north-facing benches where soil retains moisture. Bulls will often seek out those microclimates because they offer both food and security. You might glass a sunny slope that looks perfect and see nothing, but 300 yards away, tucked into the shade where dew lasts until noon, you'll find fresh poop, tracks, and the rubbed on saplings. That's the hidden rhythm of October feeding. Micro transitions within a macro shift. The herds disperse, the cows settle, and bulls begin to operate on solo or in small group routines, choosing areas where they can feed, bed, and rest in tight cycles without exposure. Another overlooked detail is timing. In September, bulls feed at night and often into daylight while chasing cows. But in October, their daylight movement becomes conservative again. They'll often feed aggressively right at first light, then again late in the evening, spending midday hours bedded in dark timber or thick edge cover. This compressed feeding schedule means your window of opportunity is short, but predictable. If you can identify their main food sources and set up to glass those first or last light feeding zones, you'll dramatically improve your odds of catching bulls on their feet. October is not the time to hope elk wander into your path. It's the time to read the country for signs of forage quality. Elk are where the feed is best, period. They'll shift entire home ranges based on moisture retention, late season green up, and snow depth. If you follow the calories, you're going to be following the bulls. The takeaway from this first phase of October is simple. The rut is about opportunity. The post-rut is about efficiency. The elk that burned themselves out chasing cows are now calculating every move based on nutrition and security. Your job as a hunter is to understand how those two things overlap, and the common ground between them is almost always food. Once you understand that bulls are driven by efficiency and recovery, the next question becomes, what are they actually eating? October is a month of transition, right? And the key to finding elk is understanding which food sources still hold life as the rest of the mountain browns out. The main categories are going to be simple: grasses, forbs, shrubs, and woody browse. But how elk use them depends heavily on elevation, slope aspect, and moisture. Every region across the West, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, follows very similar general patterns, even though the plant species vary. Let's start with grasses, because they make up the foundation of an elk's diet this time of year. Early in the month, they're still keen on residual green growth from summer. Species like bluegrass, wheatgrass, fescue, and sedges that hang on in shaded pockets. But as the nights get colder, the upper stems dry out, and the lower bases, especially on south-facing slopes, can still hold moisture and sugar. That's why bulls often feed low and broad in early morning, right? Grazing on those short green bases where frost melts first. By mid to late October, most grasses lose their nutritional edge, but elk will continue to graze them for bulk feed. When the carbs in the grasses drop, bulls turn towards forbs and transitional feed, broadleaf plants like clover, dandelion, and wild geranium that stay palatable longer. Forbs are rare above 8,500 feet this late in the year, so elk are going to follow them down into the benches, the burns, and the foothill meadows where a mix of sun and moisture keeps a few species alive. You'll often find fresh poop and track clusters in those transition zones, clear indicators of a bull's short-term feeding area. The third category is where things get really interesting: shrubs and woody browse. When frost kills off the green, elk pivot towards shrubs like snowberry, serviceberry, chokecherry, willows, Mount mahogany. Those are all plants that are crucial because they maintain digestible nutrients after most grasses and forbs have dried up. In fact, browse plants often test higher in crude protein than the dead grasses, so that makes them a critical fall and winter food source. If you've ever glassed elk in late October, feeding in what looks like poor country, right? Rocky side hills, burned timber, patchy oak brush, that's what they're after. The best browse grows in those rugged transition zones where sunlight, slope, and disturbance overlap. Burn scars especially attract elk this time of year because regrowth shrubs sprout low, tender shoots that are nutrient rich and easy to digest. Pay close attention to elevation and aspect. In most western ranges, elk will key on the lower halves of slopes in the morning, especially those that catch early sun. By midday, they retreat into north and northeast faces with shaded edges and mixed vegetation. Those shady benches and timberlines often contain lingering forbs and green grasses bases long after the open slopes have gone dormant. If you find a slope that offers both a grassy lower edge and thick browse cover above it, you've just found prime October feeding ground. Another major player that hunters overlook is regenerating vegetation, the second green up that happens after fall rains or snowmelt. Even a single autumn storm can spark a flush of new shoots along seeps, springs, and disturbed ground. Elk are quick to find those. Those small green pockets often hold a handful of animals when the rest of the landscape looks dead. A well-timed cold rain or light snow event in October can shift bull concentrations overnight. One day they're scattered in dark timber, the next they're back on those fresh green ridges gorging before winter sets in. If you're scouting from maps or satellite imagery, pay attention to burn scars from 2 to 5 years old, aspen pockets, and south-facing benches that sit below the main ridge lines. Those microhabitats combine the right mix of browse, regrowth, and accessibility. Elk don't just feed on what's available, they feed where nutrition and security overlap. And that's almost always in those edgy environments, right? Where they can feed, bed, and escape without crossing open ground. The common thread between all of these food sources is one thing: availability tied to comfort. In October, elk aren't covering miles to feed. They're choosing zones that let them feed efficiently and bed within a few hundred yards. When you find a mix of green grasses, scattered forbs, and browse tucked near dark cover, you're in their living room. If you want to find bulls in October, stop looking for where the food was in the summer and start looking for where the nutrition still is in October. Knowing what elk eat in October is one thing. Knowing where to find it is another. Feed quality isn't uniform across a mountain. It shifts with sunlight, soil, moisture, and slope angle. Learning how to read those factors separates hunters who wander from hunters who locate the elk fast. Start by looking at slope aspect, which is the single biggest indicator of October forage. South and southeast slopes receive the most sunlight, so they hold warmth and melt frost earlier in the morning. That keeps grass bases soft and green longer into fall. Elk often start their morning feeding on those sunny faces before retreating into the shadows. North slopes, on the other hand, hold moisture better and grow thicker vegetation, but they lose the nutritional value faster once heavy frost sets in. That's why you often see bulls feeding just below a ridge on the south side at first light, then easing back into north-facing cover by mid-morning. Moisture retention plays a huge role here as well. Even in dry years, small seeps, springs, and drainage bottoms act as magnets. Any place where water lingers longer than surrounding ground supports green vegetation late into the year. You can find these on topo maps or satellite imagery by looking for darker strips of vegetation or linear shadows that indicate small drainages or trickles. When you see a cluster of green in otherwise brown country, mark it. That's exactly the kind of spot a post-rut bull will feed in quietly. Next, look at elevation and temperature overlap. In early October at least, high country feed is still viable, especially on lower elevation benches below ridge lines where sun exposure meets moisture. As the month progresses, cold air pools in those same basins at night, freezing vegetation sooner. That's when elk begin dropping a few hundred to 1,000 feet lower. The trick is to stay one step ahead of that migration curve. If you're finding heavy frost at daylight or snow that lingers past noon, the bulls have likely already moved down, not because of snow quantity, but because they're looking for the green. So you've got to be looking at that also, not from sign from a week ago. The most productive country this time of year has diversity, a blend of open feed, brushy edge, and nearby security cover. Elk don't like committing to one-dimensional terrain. They prefer areas where they can shift behavior with temperature or pressure without leaving the drainage. A perfect October feeding zone usually includes a patchwork of young grass, browse, and scattered timber or aspen cover. From a distance, it often looks broken. It's uneven terrain rather than wide open meadows. If it looks too pretty and uniform, it's probably overgrazed and long abandoned. Another key here is the quality, and we want to look for color and contrast. When you glass a slope and it all blends into dull brown, move on. But when you see patches of subtle green, dark moisture lines, or bright golden strips of young grass, that's active growth. Use your optics to look for the texture. Short new shoots stand out when you train your eyes for them. Elk have a knack for finding those same small patches. They'll walk right past acres of dry grass to feed on a 30-yard pocket of regrowth. So don't overlook areas like burn scars either. In October, a burn that's 2 to 5 years old can be gold. The first couple of years after a fire, feed is too sparse. But once vegetation thickens and competition returns, burns explode with nutrient-rich forbs and shrubs. Bulls love them because burns often sit adjacent to thick security cover and provide both high-value food and visibility. If you glass a slope with old snags, green undergrowth, and shaded pockets of brush, spend some time there. When scouting digitally, make sure you try to prioritize the mid-elevation bands between 7,000 and 8,500 feet in a lot of western ranges. Those bands hold moisture longer, transition feed types, and give elk easy access to timber. On maps, you're looking for broken contour lines that indicate benches and small shelves. Those are prime spots for morning feeding before thermals flip. Finally, remember that the landscape tells you what the elk already know. The richest food grows where conditions overlap. Sun, water, and protection meet in very specific places. Benches below cliffs, the edge of small drainages, the upper half of south slopes, or the bottoms of aspen draws. Those intersections are where October elk spend their time. Learn to read them like a bull would, and you're going to stop hunting where elk should be and start hunting where they are. Understanding what elk eat and where that food grows is only half the battle, right? The real key to October success is knowing how elk use those food sources and how their daily movement revolves around them. Once you can predict the rhythm between feeding, bedding, and transition, you stop hunting country and you start hunting the behavior. When the rut ends, bulls operate on short, efficient cycles. They're not covering miles like they did in September. Instead, they're living in tight loops, feeding for an hour or two in the morning, bedding most of the day, and feeding again for a short window before dark. That pattern is all about calorie conservation. They know winter is coming, and they're rebuilding body weight while minimizing their exposure to risk. If you can locate where those loops overlap, feed, bed, and security cover within a small area, you've found a high probability October zone. Morning behavior is often the most telling. Bulls typically begin feeding in the pre-dawn hours while thermals are still dropping. As the sun rises and slopes start to warm, they're going to feed their way uphill towards shade, often bedding just inside the timber edge above the last feed line. This means your best glassing or ambush window is the first hour after daylight, focused on the upper edges of open slopes, benches, or small meadows. If you wait until the sun is high, you're already a little late and the bulls may have been gone. During midday, elk movement slows almost nothing, right? Bulls stay bedded in shade, usually on north or northeast aspects where they can stay cool and hidden. But don't assume they're locked down for good. Around mid-afternoon, especially on cooler days, bulls often rise to stretch, nibble a little bit, or, shift beds based on wind and temperature. If you're patient and glass those shaded transition edges from a distance, you can often catch movement that a lot of hunters never see because they're back at camp. Evening behavior mirrors morning patterns in reverse. As the temperature drops and thermals begin to settle, bulls ease back out of the timber and drop slightly downhill to feed. They often hit the same openings night after night if pressure stays light. Those feeding zones where sign piles up and poop stays moist are some of the best places to set up quietly and let the elk come to you. The trick is to arrive early. You got to stay still, play the wind, use those thermals in your favor. One of the most overlooked aspects of post-rut movement is how wind and feed interact. Bulls prefer feeding zones that allow them to smell danger before stepping out. That's why you'll often see them feed on slopes where the evening thermals drift upward until the sun cools enough, it gets shaded enough where it starts to drop. In those areas, they can scent the open meadow before exposing themselves. If the wind doesn't favor them, they'll oftentimes stay put until it does. Smart hunters plan setups around those airflow shifts, positioning above feed rather than below it. Elevation also plays into this behavioral rhythm. In early October, bulls might still be feeding high, keying on regrowth in open basins. But as frosts deepen, they shift downslope towards mixed vegetation zones, timbered ridges, brushy draws, and transition benches. The more extreme the weather, the tighter those loops are going to become. By late October, bulls may only move a few hundred yards between feed and bed, living like ghosts inside of small drainages that look empty from the outside. The bulls you'll find in October are rarely the ones bugling in September. They're older, quieter, and cautious. Their behavior is calculated. Every movement has a reason tied directly to food and safety. That's why your approach has to mirror their mindset. You're no longer reacting to sound, you're reading their patterns. If you want to consistently find bulls in this phase, study where the best forage aligns with security and wind. Move slow, glass deliberately. Time your hunts around natural feeding rhythms, not just convenience. Because in October, bulls aren't random, they're predictable. And the hunters who learn the feeding behavior to daily movement find themselves exactly where the elk want to be. October is a month of clarity for those who understand elk priorities. When the rut ends, the noise fades, and everything that once felt chaotic simplifies into one truth. Bulls go where the best food is. They're not wandering to breed, bugle, or posture anymore. They're rebuilding. Every step they take in October is about balancing calories and safety. If you learn to read that equation, you'll find them long after most hunters have packed it in. Follow the moisture lines. Study the slopes that catch morning sun and hold late green. Glass for texture and contrast instead of just shape. And always look for the overlap between good feed and dark cover, because that's where bulls feed, bed, and recover. It's easy to overthink October elk hunting, but at its core, it's a survival game. The elk's only focus is food and rest. The hunter's only focus should be finding where those two needs meet. If you can discipline yourself to slow down, glass longer, and read the small details in terrain and vegetation, you're going to start seeing elk where others swear there are none. The beauty of this time of year is that it rewards observation over action. You don't have to chase, you just have to understand. October hunting isn't about forcing encounters, it's about aligning with the rhythm of a recovering bull. Learn that rhythm and you'll not only find elk, but you'll understand why they're there. If you're serious about taking this kind of knowledge deeper, that's exactly why I built Team Backbone. It's more than just a membership. It's a way to sharpen your edge with exclusive tools, strategies, and a tribe of hunters who refuse to quit. Inside, you're going to get 20% off site-wide on all Backbone Unlimited gear, a member-only t-shirt shipped to your door every month, not available anywhere else, full access to the digital content vault, guides, checklists, fitness programming, backcountry strategies, and mindset training, a private Facebook group with direct access to me, and a community of driven hunters who live relentless, direct call, text, or email access to me for personalized advice on training, hunting strategy, or just sharpening your edge, and automatic entry into monthly gear giveaways. This is built for the guys who train for the hunt, push themselves in the off season, and want to be part of a tribe that makes them better. If you're ready for that kind of inner circle, then Team Backbone is waiting for you at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.